What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
So welcome to our show. It's Wednesday, September 20th, 2017, middle of the weekday, hump day, starting that long, slow glide down to Pauhana Friday and another insane week. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about today. Our phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And Mike is in our control room, twiddling our dials, keeping us out of trouble, and ready to answer the phone when you call on in. So getting into the news here, a lot of people are still reacting to Donald Trump's speech yesterday, and not always in a very, very positive way here. Iran's Zarif is out there saying that Trump's speech really belongs in medieval times. He called it ignorant hate speech, and saying faking empathy for the Iranian people is not going to fool anybody. So that did not go over very well at all. The Venezuelan leaders were very unhappy over his remarks, calling them shameless, ignorant, and aggressive. And apparently, Chief of Staff John Kelly wasn't all that happy with the speech either. Apparently he was captured with his head in his hands, kind of a Picard double facepalm, as he listened to the president basically threaten to totally destroy 25 million people, which is generally something you do not do at the United Nations. And a lot of people are seeing this speech as an absolute disaster in terms of foreign diplomacy. And again, we've seen a lot of the same rhetoric before. Article coming out of defense1.com. Trump is trying to hoodwink us into another war, this time with Iran. And we've been down this path before. Trumped up charges of weapons of mass destruction. And again, you've got the Aiea once again saying there's no there, as they did in Iraq. And they're out there pushing that propaganda. Oh, yes, somehow Iran has got secret underground nuclear weapons bases. Israel told us, and they would never lie to us. And one of the things people caught on was Trump was trying to conflate Pyongyang with Tehran, basically equating them both with each other as the new axis of evil, and basically focusing on Tehran's non-nuclear policies, which were never part of the P5+1, and false claims of the unevenness of the Iran deal. Now, even Trump's staff is saying this is actually a good deal. It's keeping Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And the problem is there is no deal that will address the totality of U.S.-Iran tensions unless Trump is willing to engage in diplomacy. And so far, Trump has shown zero interest in negotiations with Iran. He's talking entirely with Israel, and Israel wants the U.S. to go kill Iran for them. So it is a bit of a problem. Now, let's take a look at some of the things Trump's actually said in his speech. He got up there saying, we want harmony and friendship, not conflict and strife. And there was a lot of suppressed laughter out there because U.S. foreign policy since 9/11 has been nothing if not violent, aggressive, belligerent, and invasive. U.S. soldiers have occupied Iraq since 2003 after toppling Saddam Hussein's regime over lies about Saddam's nuclear weapons, which turned out not to exist. Since 2001, U.S. airstrikes have peppered Yemen to reportedly eliminate al-Qaeda militants. But the United Nations itself calls the Saudi-led and U.S.-backed coalition in Yemen the worst humanitarian crisis on earth. And U.S. forces are now going into places like Somalia. They're going more troops into Afghanistan. This doesn't look like a nation that wants harmony and friendship. This looks like a war nation, a warmongering nation. Trump also said no one has shown more contempt for other nations and the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea. It is responsible for the starvation deaths of millions of North Koreans and for the imprisonment, torture, killing, and oppression of countless more, end quote. Well, the United States has engaged, well, first of all, we know the United States engaged in torture in Iraq and tried to cover it up and failed. Was torture for the sake of torture. They tortured innocent Iraqis to death to find nuclear weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, for all you Kafka fans out there. And to silence potential leakers of the United States torture program, the CIA told its own contractors who it paid to design the torture program a nuclear bomb was going to be exploded in the United States, and that because I told them to stop, I'd lost my nerve, and it was going to be my fault if I didn't continue. That crafted scenario, that a bomb is going to explode and you have to torture the person to find it on out. And by the way, that situation has never really existed in real life. It's a storyline from a TV show to justify the torture of people. And again, there were no nuclear bombs. So the scenario of a nuclear bomb going off over the United States was a complete fraud. Trump then went on to say, we cannot let a murderous regime continue these destabilizing activities while building dangerous missiles, and we cannot abide by an agreement if it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States of America. Now, Trump has long sought to avoid the reality that the Iran deal has worked. And, of course, there was never any question that it was going to work from the Iran side because they weren't really building a nuclear weapon. This was a no-brainer for Iran. We're not actually building nukes. They'll lower the sanctions if we promise not to build nukes. Yeah, sure, we'll sign that deal. And then, of course, the U.S. didn't remove all the sanctions and has now added more. Now, Tehran has been certified compliant with the terms stipulated in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the P5+1. Nevertheless, the Iran war hawks in Washington are still pushing to get that war going and to find some way to get out of the deal without making it look like the United States has just walked away from another treaty obligation. Trump went on to say, fortunately, the United States has done very well since Election Day last November 8th. The stock market is at an all-time high, a record. Unemployment is at its lowest level in 16 years. Well, we know that that is not entirely accurate. Yes, the stock market's up. In fact, it's at a new peak today. But the unemployment numbers are an absolute fiction. We have 100 million American citizens willing and able to work who have not been able to find jobs for months, if not years. And adding in all these immigrants and refugees is only making that situation worse. Then Trump went on to say, in America, we seek stronger ties of business and trade with all nations of goodwill, which is kind of hard to swallow when you look at all the sanctions the U.S. government has thrown at everybody, at Russia. Now they're talking about sanctioning China, which would be an economic disaster for us. Sanctions on North Korea, more sanctions on Iran. It's amazing. It was, give him 3.5 Pinocchios, I think, on that one. All right, we're going to take some phone calls here. Dustin in New Jersey, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
I give Trump 1 Pinocchio.
Oh, okay.
Rouhani gets 4 Pinocchios.
Okay.
Rouhani gets 4 Pinocchios, though. His speech was good. And, hey, Mike, I hope Putin and Xi Jinping don't go because, like, if I was them, I would not, like, be together in the same area of, like, of the country. But, you know, at this point, you know, it's because, like, the president and the vice president being at the same thing when there's, like, a crisis. And, you know, the Russia and the Chinese, you know, they got to start thinking strategically now because they're the enemy now. You know, everybody's the enemy to these small group of people, Mike.
I have no doubt that Russia and China have been thinking strategically for many, many years now. And we're seeing it reflected in their weapons acquisition programs and in the way they're exercising and deploying their forces. So I think China and Russia have understand fully what the U.S. wants to do. Russia and China do not want a war with the United States, but they can see that one is coming. If these war hawks, neocons in Washington, D.C. get their way, there's going to be a war with Russia and China, which we're probably going to lose.
Hey, Mike, switching gears, Morgan Not-So-Freedom is a disgrace, and so is this committee to investigate Russia. Did you see that video?
Yeah, I did.
Morgan Freeman?
Yeah, he's out there saying we're at war with Russia, but I wouldn't give it that much weight. Back in 2005, he was telling us we were at war with the Martians, so, you know.
But that's the same group that brought us that Hamilton 67 that labeled the 100 enemies of America, including Ron Paul. And you know who's on the board of advisors is James Clapper and Tucker Carlson's best friend forever, Max Booth.
Yes.
And Where'd they get the money to give Morgan Freeman, unless he's like a part of a deep state? Because, I don't think he comes cheap, and it's just more propaganda for this machine. It's a machine, Mike. I mean, I never seen anything like it. It's all coming out. You can see this machine in action.
Well, Morgan Freeman probably doesn't need the money, and so if he made this film, he's absolutely convinced that this was the right thing for him to do, to lend his celebrity weight to this program of saying we're at war with Russia. And we're seeing all of Hollywood is all on board with that. Remember Indiana Jones' Kingdom of the Crystal Skull? We're going to bash the Russians. The Russians are evil. They're nasty. They're bad people. And we've been seeing it now for a couple of years. This run-up to a new war with Russia is being telegraphed by so many of the films and TV shows we're getting out of the entertainment industry. It actually is one reason I'm almost glad to be out of that business now. I'd be ashamed to walk down the street, knowing how entertainment is being used to propagandize for a new war.
They probably put a paper on the back of you that says Russian agent.
They're already doing that.
It's sad, Mike. Like, I'm 47 years old. I've never seen anything like this ever, like this whole. But one thing that's, we know who the enemy is. We know who the enemy is, and they got to be brought to the cornfield, Mike, because eventually, if we don't bring them to the cornfield, they're going to bring all of us to the cornfield, if you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, you're welcome. And again, people here in Hawaii, we're very, very nervous. Because not so much about North Korea, but if we get into a shooting nuclear war with Russia and China, this island will get hit. There's no question about it. And Claire and I, we got a ringside seat on a first strike target out there. We're going to go back to the telephones here. Steve in California, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
I was deeply bothered by the Trump speech about taking out pretty much North Korea and that whole propaganda thing of using fear. I see this thing. This thing is very scripted. You do it every time. I mean, we have a whole industry that's a war industry, weaponry industry, where we sell to other countries, destabilize the world. Then we come in a couple of years later and then clean up all the mess that we actually created. I mean, this is. You're right. We are a nation that's addicted to war. The people aren't, but the government is.
Yes, thank you for the clarification.
I'm deeply bothered by how he said that he wanted to. We would have to destroy North Korea, and that brought me back to Harry S. Truman dropping 2 nuclear bombs on heavily populated cities, which is a war crime, an act of war. It's a war crime because those were not military bases, as we were told. I'm very deeply troubled by this guy. We were duped. We had the lesser of two evils, and I hate saying that, but that's true what we had. We had a criminal, and now we had a guy here who's definitely being controlled, and he's turning out to be kind of a warmonger, and I'm very unhappy about this whole situation. Very unhappy.
I'm very unhappy about it as well. I'm very disappointed. I know that already they're worried about losing the Trump base in next year's midterm elections and certainly in 2020, and it's going to happen. Trump is going to be a single-term president. And forget all this talk about, impeachment and all the rest of it. Trump is destroying his own base. The people who supported him and voted him into office did so on this promise that we were going to get off this track of endless wars. And we're leading to a catastrophe. And again, in a nuclear war, nobody really wins except those bankers. But at this point, the United States military may be little more than a hollow shell. We've had 16 years of war during which our stockpiles have been drawn down. Our existing weapons are worn out. The new weapons rolling off those assembly lines at the defense plants are junk, overpriced junk. We don't have the money or the manufacturing or the manpower to prevail in a war against Russia and China, even if it goes nuclear.
Well, it just takes me back to that General Wesley Clark audio video where he talked about 7 countries in 5 years and all the countries on that list. And, I mean, they're just trying so hard to provoke somebody to take the bait to do this war. And on the RBN website today, it mentioned, I had a nice article on there about how the Pentagon is basically, and all the war contractors are just salivating at the thought of this could go war and the money. All they care about is the money. It's not people. It's not democracy. That's a myth. This is all economic. As you said, all wars are bankers' wars. This is economic. They call it nation building. I call it stealing another country's wealth.
That's exactly what it is.
We're doing.
That's exactly what it is. We haven't built any nations anywhere. Remember when they went into Iraq and there was going to be all this money for Iraq reconstruction and it all vanished. It all disappeared. Nobody knows where it went. It certainly didn't help the lives of the Iraqi people. Their standard of living is still way, way below what it was before the U.S. started sticking its nose in over there.
Right. Hey, thank you, Michael. Keep it up.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go here. Now, apparently, as far as I can tell, only 2 countries actually loved Trump's UN speech, and that was, of course, Israel and Saudi Arabia. And they're out there cheering for this whole thing, and basically Netanyahu's speech almost seemed like an addendum to Trump's speech. And he came on out there, and at least he didn't have that stupid little cartoon bomb this time. And he even got a chuckle from the audience when he talked about how penguins know that some things are black or white. Which is kind of clever. But again, at least he didn't have the cartoon bomb. But let us do a quick look at some of the things that he said and whether they stand up. Now, one of the things Netanyahu said was, well, as you know, I strongly disagreed. I warned that when the sanctions on Iran would be removed, Iran would behave like a hungry tiger unleashed, not joining the community of nations, but devouring nations one after the other. And that's precisely what Iran is doing today. Now, in reality, Iran occupies 0 countries and has not occupied any country in modern history. By contrast, Israel has occupied part of Syria, the Golan Heights, since 1967. This occupation is condemned by the United Nations and all 5 permanent members of the Security Council, including the United States. Now, the other country on Netanyahu's list that has been occupied by Israel and not Iran is Lebanon. After invading Lebanon in 1982, Israel set up a permanent occupying force in southern Lebanon. So who is it who's gobbling up nation after nation? And let's not even start about what Israel's trying to do to Palestine or the remnants of Palestine. Iran isn't gobbling up anything. The only reason Iran is not interacting with the grand community of nations is it's still under sanctions. It's still being deliberately isolated by those U.S. sanctions. Then Netanyahu went on to say, we will act to prevent Iran from establishing permanent military bases in Syria for its air, sea, and ground forces, which sounds grandiose except for one thing. Iran, like Russia, is in Syria at the request of the Syrian government, and that's none of Israel's business. Israel has nothing to say about the internal affairs of other people's countries. Of course, they don't think that. That's why they're always messing around with our country. And then, of course, Netanyahu went on with the already discredited propaganda about how Assad has barrel-bombed and starved and gassed and murdered hundreds of thousands of his own citizens, blah, 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 blah. If at first you don't succeed, lie, lie again. And finally, of course, he said, 2 years ago I stood here, that's when he had the cartoon bomb, explained why the Iranian nuclear deal not only doesn't block Iran's path to the bomb, Iran's nuclear program has a sunset clause. Now, yes, the P5+1 deal does prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And again, nobody could prove they were developing even before this agreement. They're just making this stuff up out of thin air to try and justify a war in which Americans will be killed and crippled, because that's how it happened the last time. Israel sold us the war in Iraq. Look how many of our kids came home dead or wounded from that. And they're doing the exact same thing with Iran all over again. Fool me once, Benjamin, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about Netanyahu's speech up at the United Nations, where he's just going after Iran, calling Iran a hungry tiger unleashed, and basically saying that because of the P5+1 deal, Iran has now been emboldened to spread its influence across the region, and by golly, that's Israel's job. And so that's basically his entire argument. Israel wants Iran smashed up because Israel wants unfettered control over the Middle East. And that's it entirely. And Netanyahu is not getting a free ride on this. A lot of world leaders are standing up and saying, no, we've heard all of this before. We've been hearing about how Iran is just weeks away from a nuclear weapon, going back 30 years, and it hasn't happened yet. And again, Iran has not initiated a war of conquest in over 200 years, certainly not in modern history. They haven't occupied other countries the way Israel's constantly doing. Netanyahu's speech was the height of hypocrisy. Now, the French president has come on out. Now, the French have already said they see no reason to renegotiate the P5+1 deal. And the French president came on out and said there's never going to be an efficient solution in Syria without the presence of Iran. Iran is a key player in the war against terror. And, of course, Israel is not happy about that at all. Now, turning to the domestic politics, as you know, we've got this bizarre situation where it's finally been admitted that, yes, Donald Trump's campaign manager was being wiretapped, both before and after the election. And there are several ramifications. First of all, James Clapper lied to Congress and to the American people when he said none of Trump's people were being wiretapped. And over on Fox, Judge Napolitano is saying, yeah, when Trump made that accusation he was being wiretapped, he was speaking the truth. And what's really interesting, going over to CNN, and you see them, way back then, Trump's nonsense, no wiretapping, and then they grudgingly had to say, yes, it appears Trump was wiretapped. Now they've even backtracked, and they're trying to go back and say, well, it really was no big deal. It was nothing. He shouldn't have made a big deal about that. It's ridiculous. Hillary Clinton, who will not go away. It's very obvious she thinks she's coming back into public life and that we will welcome her and embrace her. Oh, and by the way, we were at the big box store earlier today, and her book is already on the closeout shelf. But Hillary Clinton is now comparing herself to Paul Revere. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. And she's back to that whole thing that Russia stole the election from her to give to Donald Trump. No evidence for it whatsoever. Now, as you know, now that Manafort has been acknowledged to have been wiretapped in connection with the Russian investigation. That's how the media is spinning it. Oh, he was wiretapped, and it had to do with the Russia investigation. So Paul Manafort is now demanding the Department of Justice to release all the transcripts of all of his tapped phone calls so the American public can come to the same conclusion that the Department of Justice did. There is nothing there. It's all rumor and innuendo. And it is rather bizarre to see Hillary coming on back, acting like she still has some kind of a path to that Oval Office. She's out there saying she wants to question the legitimacy of the 2016 election, even though she admits there's no legal or constitutional way to do so. So what is she planning? A coup d'etat? And speaking of foreign interference in elections, Obama encouraged illegal immigrants to vote in our election. Amherst and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and San Francisco are going to allow illegal immigrants to vote in the local elections. Democrats encourage foreigners vote. And yet they're paranoid about foreign influence on our elections. How much more out of touch with reality can you get? It's okay for foreigners to vote as long as they vote straight Democratic, but by golly, we can't have any interference that throws things toward the Republican direction here. Harumph, harumph. Maxine Waters has set a new personal low. She was actually at the funeral for comedian Dick Gregory, and she was giving a eulogy and turned it into a call for Trump's impeachment. In the middle of a eulogy, in the middle of a funeral. You want to talk about obsessive behavior? There you go. We'll be right back after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And as if we didn't have enough to worry about right now, it's looking like the entire ring of fire is on a tear right now. We had that monster 7.1 earthquake near Mexico City, and that was preceded by an even larger quake less than 2 weeks before that. Just hours after the deadly 7.1 earthquake in Mexico City, they had a 6.1 quake in New Zealand. They had another 6.1 quake hit Japan earlier today, and I just got the flash notice from the USGS. They've had a 6.4 quake in Vanuatu. So, boy, it's really rocking and rolling out there. Interesting time. Interesting time to be a seismologist, I guess. Speaking of the Mexico City earthquake, they're now starting to, shall I say, focus in. They think that the death toll is going to be a little above 200 and not go much higher. But right now, one of the big problems they're dealing with, apparently a Mexico City school collapsed, and they're still trying to dig through the rubble and find the children who were trapped inside. So just absolute horrific. And unfortunately, Mexico does not really have a stringent earthquake code for most of the country. And again, as I explained yesterday, all of Mexico City in that area is actually a filled-in lake. And it's all alluvial fill, and that actually is pretty much the worst kind of terrain you can build on if you are in an earthquake zone. So it's a very, very tragic situation. But I guess anywhere you live, there's going to be something. Out here in Hawaii, it's tsunamis and hurricanes. Tornado Alley, it's tornadoes, although we get tornadoes here in Hawaii occasionally. Hurricanes in the Gulf, eastern seaboard, wildfires out west, they're still dealing with that mess. Boy, oh boy, I mean, I got to tell you, it almost bothered me that Trump's up there at the United Nations talking about making war on all these other countries and doesn't really seem to be clued into the fact that our country right now is in serious, serious trouble between an economy that is flashing red warning meltdown alarms, all the fires out west, most of which were exacerbated by cutting the funding for fire prevention out there. Then you've got the aftermath of Harvey down in Texas, where they've got huge numbers of mosquitoes, brain-eating bacteria in the water supply. The floodwaters flowed through sewage treatment plants. There's raw sewage in the floodwaters. It tore up some toxic waste sites that weren't being properly maintained. Same thing for the aftermath of Hurricane Irma. This country's in serious, serious trouble. And it almost seems like we have a federal government that just doesn't want to be bothered in their rush to bring disaster to the rest of the world. Now, speaking of hurricanes, getting into Hurricane Maria, it's basically over Puerto Rico right now. Those poor people, they got hit really hard by Irma. They're saying that Puerto Rico's entire power system could be knocked out for months. I'm wondering how they're doing over at the Arecibo Radio Telescope, which is there. It's still predicted to miss the U.S. mainland, although some of the outer edges of the storm are probably going to bring rain up to the northeast. It's going to brush along there, but at least you won't be getting those hurricane force winds. So let's talk about the war zones, emphasis on the plural, because it seems like we're in a stage of here a war, there a war, everywhere a war, E-I-E-I-O, and the defense contractors are happy. Their part of the stock market really is going up, and there's actual value underneath those stocks to support the prices. But again, it's blood money, if you really think about it. Any profits made in the defense industry, it's all blood money. So apparently the U.S.-led coalition is trying to find a way to stop the Syrian army advance near Deir ez-Zor, especially on the eastern shore of that Euphrates River. And they're trying to find some way to do it, and they're not really doing very well. There was apparently a counterattack that was an attempt to assist anti-government forces in Deir ez-Zor, and it got pushed back. About 40 militants were killed, and they're blaming it's those gosh darn Russian attack helicopters, which, by the way, are very good helicopters. I remember years ago during Afghanistan, when they were starting to interview the leaders of the Mujahideen, and they would say, we're not afraid of the Russians, but we are afraid of their helicopters. They are very formidable. And apparently there was an attempt by the U.S.-backed rebels in a de-escalation zone in Idlib Governorate to try and retake Idlib. That failed miserably. 800 of the rebels were killed. And again, Russian aviation came to their assistance. Now, it has come on out that the U.S.-backed Kurdish factions, who are trying to get that Kurdistan, they are working with ISIS on the Syrian battlefield. And so already we're seeing where their allegiances are going to lie. If there's a new Kurdistan, they're all going to be buddy-buddy with ISIS. I don't think that's a good thing for the United States of America. It's certainly not a good thing for Syria, certainly not a good thing for Iraq. Turkey has already said they absolutely will not allow part of their country to be carved off for Kurdistan. And Iraq is saying a future Kurdistan is basically going to be another Israel. And that is an impression that was reinforced because apparently every time there's a rally in advance of this so-called referendum, you see all these Israel flags waving back and forth. I think it was a little premature, but it's really got everybody alerted to what's going on here. Now, this was a story got a lot of people kind of was scratching their head and saying what's really going on. And the story goes that Hamza bin Laden, the son of Osama bin Laden, has called on Sunni Muslims to carry out a new jihad against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his government in order to liberate Syria from the hands of what he described as infidels. Now, this was a voice recording released overnight on jihadist social media accounts. It's purported to be that of Hamza bin Laden, who should be in his late 20s about now. Nobody really knows whether it's him or not. It might be. And it wouldn't be all that surprising when you recall that Osama bin Laden was reportedly a CIA asset under the code name Tim Osman. And no doubt the CIA would approach his son to fill his father's shoes. And remember, bin Laden Construction is still doing big business with the U.S. government over in that part of the world. Osama bin Laden's older brother, Salim bin Laden, was business partners with George W. Bush in a business venture called Arbusto Energy, which went bust. And Salim bin Laden died in a suspicious small aircraft crash shortly thereafter. Now, over in Turkey, their defense minister, Nurettin Kaniki, has reiterated Ankara's opposition to a planned Kurdish independence referendum, warning that the disintegration of Iraq could trigger a global conflict. And the breakup of Iraq has been long on the U.S. and Israel's agenda. And they want to do the same thing to Iran. They want to take all the countries in the Middle East, and they want to break them up into little tiny pieces that are easy to bully, easy to push around. Now, Iran's President Rouhani has reiterated, if Trump walks out on the nuclear deal, and apparently he's going to have some kind of an announcement about that in the next couple of days, no one will trust the United States. I don't think anybody really trusts the United States right now anyway. But it's going to be very obvious that the United States, when they sign their name to a treaty, it's worthless. It's a total waste of ink. And that's going to make international relations that much more difficult at a time when we're dealing with the reality of a potential global war. Now, turning over to North Korea, South Korea is getting very nervous about all this belligerent talk. They were not happy with Trump's speech either. And they're very, very concerned that if there is a military conflict up in North Korea, it is inevitable South Korea will feel some of that pain. One thing that North Korea provably has a great deal of is long-range artillery. And it's tunneled into all those mountains along the northern side of the DMZ. They're hardened shelters, and they can reach Seoul with conventional artillery. And so Seoul is saying, there can be no military action against North Korea without our permission. So Mattis is over there trying to reassure Seoul that they can take out North Korea and nothing will happen to South Korea. He's hinting at a secret kinetic military option for North Korea. We have a secret plan where we will take out Pyongyang and Kim Jong-un, and there won't be a shot fired toward South Korea. And if you believe that one, I have some of Saddam's nuclear weapons to sell you. Now, in an update of the story, and this is where you should all get very, very nervous, apparently Mattis is talking about using tactical nuclear weapons on North Korea. And so that appears to be their solution. They're just going to go on in and turn it into a glass parking lot. But I'll tell you this, even with tactical nukes, they will not get all the artillery. And I have no doubt by now that Kim Jong-un has dispersed whatever missiles he's got into some of those same tunnels. that if he has any deployable working nuclear warheads, they're going to be scattered all over the country. They're going to be dispersed. The reality is the United States absolutely cannot make a promise that they can attack North Korea in such a way that there will not be any kind of a response, short of literally burning the entire country to the ground. And again, it would be in keeping with United States history because, again, the United States is the only country that has ever actually used nuclear weapons of mass destruction against the civilians of another country. For all the talk about Iraq's nuclear weapons, never had them, never used them. All the talk about Iran's nuclear weapons, they don't have them. All the talk about North Korea's nuclear weapons, so far all they've done is test. Only the United States has actually used nuclear weapons against the civilians of another country, and now they're talking about doing it again. And this is in response to the latest the latest missile test. Oh my goodness, they did a test, horror of horrors. It's a horrible thing when they're testing out there. And they're trying to make an issue where none exists. The United States constantly tests missiles. We have the Pacific Missile Test Range over on the next island. They're always firing stuff off from there. The U.S. has one of the largest nuclear arsenals on Earth. I don't know if it's the largest or not. Nobody makes a big deal about that. Nobody calls that provocative or a threat to the rest of the world. Even though, as I've said before, the United States is the only country that has used nuclear weapons against another country. Russia just tested an ICBM. Nobody made a big deal about that. It's only when North Korea is testing their weapons that they make a big, horrible deal about it. Now, North Korea has repeatedly made it very clear their attempt to build a nuclear deterrent is spurred on by U.S. belligerence. And the lesson from Iraq, Syria, and Iran is clear. No matter what weapons you surrender, no matter what compromises and deals you make, the United States will still target your country for invasion whenever they feel like it. The only threat from North Korea is that it is seen as standing up to U.S. bullying, and by doing so is inspiring other nations to do exactly the same. That's the only real geopolitical threat. They're refusing to bow down. Everyone's always talking about nuclear weapons. Well, there are 5 undeclared nuclear weapon states: Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. And they are in possession of nuclear weapons. Now, they're American-supplied nuclear weapons, but they're under their national control, their national command. And they're all there to deter Russian and Iranian aggression. So who's arming the world with these dangerous weapons? Now, do you remember prior to the invasion of Iraq and prior to the invasion of Libya and prior to the invasion of Yemen and prior to the invasion of everyone, there's always a slew of defectors. Oh, we have a defector. They're going to tell you the truth about what's going on inside the country. And so it's inevitable. We have a North Korean defector who claims that Kim Jong-un blew 11 musicians to bits using anti-aircraft guns. Now, I've seen some pretty bad musicians in my day, but not to the point where I felt like wasting an anti-aircraft round on them. But we have this defector. She's from Kim Jong-un's inner circle. We have to believe what she says. Vex alert on that one. Another one came on out. Same thing. Brutal and inhumane laws North Koreans are forced to live under. You know, you can go over to YouTube and you can find all kinds of videos about what life is really like in North Korea. And I think you ought to go ahead and do that. There's some very obvious propaganda videos that are out there, but there are some nice documentaries, especially from British and European TV, that show the North Koreans are actually pretty happy people. They're pretty proud of their government. And again, they're just like us. You remember that old Native American saying, before you judge somebody, walk a mile in their moccasins? And I don't know if it really originated with the Native Americans, but it's a good idea. before you get caught up in all this war rhetoric to go to war against North Korea or against Iran or against whoever, make a point of looking into their eyes and into their faces, the people, the ordinary people. And you will find, as John F. Kennedy said in his speech in Berlin, we all share this same planet. We all cherish our children's future. We all breathe the same air. And that really is what's going on. Left to ourselves, humans can live in peace. It's only these so-called leaders that churn for war because they want to smash up the world and grab the prettiest, most glittering pieces and put them in their own pockets. We're on the brink. We're on your actual brink here. Everybody knows the U.S. is going to start a war. They're just waiting for somebody to take the bait. And so far, Putin has shown tremendous restraint. I do wish Kim Jong-un would shut the heck up. But again, you have to take into account the Asian concept of face. And anybody who's conducting foreign policy involving any part of Asia who doesn't understand that concept, they're going to make horrific mistakes as to what's going on over there. So we're going to take another break for commercials. Join us on the air, 800-313-9443. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. We're going to take a phone call. Terry in Oregon, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, I'm trying to figure out why North Korea all of a sudden. And there's a couple ideas I had. One, obviously, they want to get on the border of China and Russia up there if they invade the country. I don't think those countries are going to allow it. But the other reason might be they're afraid that South Korea and North Korea are going to cut a deal and unify the country, which is something they don't want. And we've heard that the president of South Korea is talking this way, and then there's been a movement among the students in South Korea, too, to unify the country and, declare peace.
Yeah, they've been talking about it for years. 5 years ago, they were on the verge of the reunification, and then the U.S. waded on in there and said, "Oh no, they hate, they hate you up there, and North Korea is just going to suck all the wealth out of South Korea, and then all this other stuff." Basically, went in and split them up again. I think the reason for the focus on North Korea is right now our government is desperate to get this war going before the economy falls apart. And they've been pushing in Ukraine. They can't get it going there. They're pushing in Syria. They're losing in Syria. And so North Korea right now seems the right target, especially because Kim Jong-un keeps offering up fodder for the media to portray him as this out-of-control, wacky danger to the world. But again, a lot of that is deliberate mistranslation, like they did with Saddam and Gaddafi and Ahmadinejad. But the other part of it, again, it gets back to that issue of face. Kim Jong-un must look strong to his own people, and he's actually garnering a lot of respect in the region for standing up to this U.S. bullying. But you're absolutely right. North Korea could be the back door to this war with China and Russia. That is the real ultimate goal, the war on the yuan and the ruble, to allow the U.S. dollar to regain hegemonic domination of the global economy. And that's what they're literally willing to risk incineration of the surface of planet Earth in this argument over whose brand of ink and paper we're all supposed to use for the next 100 years.
I agree. Thank you, Mike. Talk to you next time.
All right. Thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go. So one of the things that the U.S. is doing that is complicating the issue is they're trying to put pressure on China to rein in North Korea. And China doesn't like being put in that position. The Chinese attitude is, look, if you've got a problem with North Korea, you talk to North Korea. Don't try and drag us in here to be your proxy. And then, of course, now we have the U.S. threatening China with more economic sanctions if China doesn't do what the U.S. tells it to do. And again, getting back to that issue of face, this is not going to sit well with the Chinese leadership to be seen as doing the bidding of a foreign power. Now, ultimately, this pressure on Beijing to put pressure on Pyongyang, it's not likely to work. The Chinese might try and do what they can do to calm things down, but only if the U.S. backs off its belligerent behavior. and promises not to try regime change, which, by the way, is a violation of the UN Charter. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Now, China is out there saying that threats are not going to work as a solution for the North Korea nuclear crisis. And no, they're not. The more the U.S. threatens, the more they fly their airplanes and bombers close to North Korea, the more they sail their warships along North Korea's coastline, the faster and harder Kim Jong-un is going to work to finish that nuclear deterrent. Because he understands that is the only way he's going to save his nation from a U.S. intervention. As I said before, lesson learned from Iraq and from Syria and from Iran. Iraq surrendered all their chemical weapons, still got invaded. Syria surrendered all their chemical weapons, still trying to be invaded. Iran has agreed to the P5+1 deal, and now Trump wants to throw it out and invade anyway. So there's the object lesson. It doesn't matter what weapons you give up. If the U.S. wants you to come in and take your country, they're going to come in and take your country. The only thing that's going to hold them off is if Kim Jong-un finishes his nuclear deterrent. And that's how he's thinking. Now, ultimately, in the long run, China will not pressure North Korea as much as Trump wants. And the reasons are manifold, partly because North Korea is an ally of China, has been for a very long time. That would be like some other country coming in and demanding Canada tell the United States to stop invading all these other countries. And again, there is that issue of face. The Chinese leadership do not want to be seen as errand boys for outsiders. So that's not going to work. Now, we have been talking about military waste, huge amounts of money that go for stuff that just does not work. We've been talking about the F-22, the F-35, Independence-class littoral combat ships, Freedom-class littoral combat ships, the Zumwalt stealth destroyer. And I think a good example of the sheer waste that's going on in the military is illustrated by this story that came out of Sputnik News. Emboldened by the increase in military spending, the Pentagon is already out there buying stuff here. And the Pentagon has just awarded General Dynamics Land Systems a $311 million contract to build 7 M1A2 Abrams System Enhancement Package Variant 4 prototypes. What makes this interesting is the U.S. Army revealed it has not even accepted delivery of the prototypes for earlier versions. In other words, they're just ordering the stuff, and even before it's delivered, they're ordering the next one after that. Huge amounts of waste. You have to see it to believe it. I had a little exposure to it both at my time in NASA and when I was working for Robert Abel, and we did that project for Martin Marietta, and it's just the scale of spending and how much money. It's a shock. It's going to be a shock to normal Americans. Normal American citizens, money for us is something coming out of an eyedropper. Maybe for a company or a corporation, it's a garden hose. In the military, they've got fire hoses. Banks and banks of fire hoses. That's just how fast the money is coming and going. It's amazing. Now, the Senate's military spending increase, just the increase, not the whole budget, but just that increase, if it had been put into education, we would have free public college for every American citizen. But no. You will take out student loans and you will live your life in debt servitude because we got to spend the money on stuff that goes bang and kills people. Article out of The Hill, no less, talking about Rand Paul was trying to get an amendment to the NDAA to basically retract the ongoing congressional war authorization, saying that one congressional war authorization shouldn't last for decades. If you read the Constitution, when there is a war, Congress must approve it. If we're going to have a war with Iraq, there has to be a declaration of war by Congress. If we're going to have a war with Libya, there should be a separate declaration of war against Libya by the Congress. If we're going to go to war against Syria, there should be a separate declaration of war by the Congress for that. But all the way back in 2003, I think it was, George Bush got Congress to pass an authorization for the use of force for the president. And then to activate it, George Bush actually lied to the Congress, which made the whole mess illegal. He sent a letter of transmittal saying that Saddam Hussein was in possession of banned weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be a lie, and was part of the group who carried out the 9/11 attacks, which even George Bush is on video saying Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. So it was a lie, which rendered the whole thing invalid. Fraud negates consent. And ever since then, every single war goes back to that authorization. It's just a blanket authorization, a blank check, if you will. Carte blanche for more and more war. And Rand Paul is correct on this. We can't give the president a license to start wars at will, or we're going to find ourselves in endless wars, which is where we're going right now. We're going to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. One area that people ought to be looking at, and maybe this is the reason why they're pouring more forces and more money into both Syria and Afghanistan, not to necessarily win, but at least to pretend we're not losing. Because according to this article that came out of Club Orlov blogspot up in Canada, a military defeat or a perceived military defeat could trigger the financial collapse of the United States of America. And this article basically draws a lot of parallels, comparing the collapse of the Soviet Union to the coming collapse of the United States. And a big part of it was that huge amount of military spending by the Soviet government at the expense of their own nation. Now, our stock market, the one part of the stock market that's really doing well are those defense contracts. If there is a perceived military defeat, everybody's going to get cold feet and they're going to start bailing. And that could be the beginning of the end. Meanwhile, over at the Bank of International Settlements, they're warning now that the global debt bubble is now understated by $13 trillion. Apparently because of the exclusion of foreign exchange derivatives used to hedge international trade and foreign currency bonds. In other words, the bookkeeping methodology isn't accurate. And we know those derivatives are a huge, huge sword of Damocles hanging over the world's economic system. Story coming out of Asia Times. Threats against China could result in another Great Depression. And they're talking about how U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin's threat of a trade war against China, if it doesn't get North Korea into line, it's not going to accomplish anything. But it could trigger a global economic tsunami. Much of the world is dependent on Chinese manufacturing. Much of the world now uses the yuan. Now, up in Illinois, as you know, last July, they narrowly avoided a junk bond rating with a last-minute budget deal that included a 32% increase in state income taxes. Republican Governor Bruce Rauner vetoed the budget and called it a disaster, but both houses of the state legislature voted to override his veto, so the tax increase went through. Meanwhile, Standard & Poor's and Moody's were apparently both convinced the budget deal was sufficient for the state to remain an investment-grade credit, and everybody lived happily ever after, at least for a couple of months, because now there's a new issue that's come on out. Apparently, up in Illinois, the unpaid vendor backlog has hit $16 billion. That means the state of Illinois owes $16 billion to the various suppliers of whatever it is the state is using. Tar for the road, office paper for the state capitol, $16 billion. So they're stiffing their own suppliers to try and keep the budget balanced, and that's obviously not a good solution. Over in San Francisco, and especially up there in Silicon Valley, everybody's just been going crazy about housing prices, and where you basically have shacks, little more than a shack, the micro houses, you've seen those on TV, going for $1.5 million. And every time somebody signs up and says, yes, I'm going to buy one of those, the market goes crazy and says, see, the prices are supportable. But apparently a survey has found 83% of Bay Area renters plan to leave the area before settling down and starting their families. A lot of single people in San Francisco, and but they're all just getting reamed on the rents there. And if 82% of them are getting ready to leave in order to buy a house and start a family, or even just rent a house and start a family, there's going to be a big, huge crash over there somewhere. Now, as you know, attempts to replace Obamacare are once again in the news. And everybody's saying every proposal put forward is basically Obamacare in a new wrapper. They're not changing anything fundamental. And according to the Wall Street Journal, the average cost of health coverage offered by employers pushed toward $19,000 for a family plan this year. In other words, the health plan now costs employers more than a new car. And at least with a new car, you get the car. With the health insurance plans, you don't really get much of anything because of those sky-high deductibles. People can be forgiven for thinking it's some kind of a giant scam. Now, over in Germany, as you know, we're coming up on the elections, which are this coming Sunday, as a matter of fact. And it is unfortunately, sadly expected that Angela Merkel's party is going to win. But it does look like the Alternative for Deutschland party is poised to become an influence in the parliament. And more than likely, there's going to be another grand coalition because Merkel's party is not going to sweep enough parliament seats to have solid control. So they're going to have a new grand coalition government. It's going to be a much weakened coalition, and the AfD party is going to be the largest opposition party. So we're not getting the result that we would have liked to have seen, or the German people would have liked to have seen, because the German people want Merkel gone. They're fed up with all this nonsense. And there may be a surprise, because these are the official poll numbers coming out of Germany, and remember the official poll numbers from last year? Hillary is going to win. She's got 95%. There's no question. Trump shouldn't even show up Election Day. There could be an upset there as well. Now, yesterday, as it turns out, was the 70th birthday of the Central Intelligence Agency, or as I like to call them, the Cocaine Importation Agency. And so it is fitting that we would go back and look at some of the history of the Central Intelligence Agency and all the wonderful things that they have done, most especially the goofs. My favorite story about the CIA, of course, is part of that part of MK Ultra, where they were out in San Francisco and they set up this sex and bondage parlor, and they hired hookers to lure men in, and they would use sex and LSD to try and find the magic formula that would get men to just reveal their deepest, darkest secrets. And it didn't work, as most government programs do, and ran for 9 years before they pulled the plug on this one. And along the way, all this testing of LSD as part of MK Ultra, it introduced LSD to the hippies. That's where it came from, where all these kids were being tested on. And they said, wow, that was interesting. What was that stuff? Well, it's LSD. Oh, good. Where can I get some? It's amazing. Now, one of the CIA's great failures was that in the late 1940s, CIA agents and analysts came to the conclusion that a Soviet nuclear weapon would only show up in the early 1950s. It actually exploded in 1949, so they missed that one here a little bit. Then there was the Afghanistan fiasco, where the CIA had absolutely no indication that Soviets were going to intervene in Afghanistan in December of 1979. And it took the Carter administration completely by surprise. Now, the CIA was convinced that Moscow would not dare take a step. And the reason Moscow went in there was the government of Afghanistan asked them to come on in and deal with this rising insurgency of the Mujahideen, who were being used by the CIA to, even back then, destabilize the Afghan governments. Probably the biggest single embarrassment to the Central Intelligence Agency was Aldrich Ames. He was a Soviet mole, and he was basically just at the heart of everything, and he worked for the Soviet Union until the Soviet Union collapsed. It was the worst leakage in U.S. intelligence history. And they didn't even find out about it until after the Soviet Union had collapsed. And then they finally arrested him and they sentenced him to life in prison. Let's skip on down some of these other things here. The CIA failed to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. Totally missed the boat on that one. Alrighty, now then, let's talk a little bit about political correctness, because it is a curse on our society. It is a curse on our society. So apparently, there was this infectious diseases expert who claims she was joking. Carol J. Baker, MD. This was back in May, but all of a sudden her comments are starting to attract attention. And she literally came on out and said that we'll just get rid of all the white people in the United States. And she said the reason for doing that was because the vast majority of people who were vaccine skeptics were white people. And she went on to say that the immigrants are superior people because they take all their vaccines, which is a little bit out there here. I love this one. There was a criminology student, 22-year-old criminology student, and she accused a taxi driver of raping her after he refused to accept a kebab-soaked $10 note. So she wanted, this lady, Sophie Poynton, wanted to be a police officer. She told police she'd been sexually assaulted in the back of the cab. And, of course, it was exposed. And so now this criminology student who wanted to be a police officer is now in prison for the next 16 months. Big Brother's definitely coming onto the college campuses. Professors told to report students who make campus less inclusive to the behavior assessment team. That's the new thought police, the new name of the thought police, the behavior assessment team. And as colleges across the country struggle with questions related to free speech on campuses, some schools are implementing policies that appear to give administrators significant latitude to discipline students for speaking in unpopular ways. Well, I'm an old-fashioned Bill of Rights kind of guy. Freedom of speech is absolute. Just because you're unpopular doesn't mean you have less of a right to say what you're going to say. A lot of the things that I say are very unpopular in certain sectors of our community, but I stand on my First Amendment right to say them. So apparently over at Utah Valley University, they distributed a guidance letter to all faculty encouraging them to report to the school's behavior assessment team students who use inappropriate language, are argumentative, or who speak loudly. Argumentative, isn't that something you're supposed to be in a college or university environment as you debate each other? I mean, law classes, philosophy classes, you're going to be argumentative. It's unavoidable. What kind of college graduates are they cranking out of these universities if they're discouraged from discussing issues? The Speaker of the Texas House is calling for the removal of a Confederate plaque in the Capitol in Austin. This is Speaker Joe Strauss, Republican of San Antonio, said Tuesday that he sent a letter to the State Preservation Board to take down the Children of the Confederacy Creed plaque that hangs on the first floor. I am really getting very opposed to this because I'm in agreement with those people who are out there saying that the snowflakes aren't just trying to erase our history, they're trying to rewrite it. And that's very, very dangerous because you have to wonder what new history are they going to try and teach our kids in order to get them to go along with a certain political agenda. I find all this talk about getting rid of white people very, very annoying. We'll be right back after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And we were talking about this a little bit before, that the flooding that followed Hurricanes Harvey and Irma have torn open some toxic waste dump sites and just spread that stuff all over. And apparently, according to a story at Associated Press, an internal watchdog is saying that the Environmental Protection Agency is mismanaging the toxic site cleanups. And they're saying basically cleanups at some U.S. hazardous waste sites have stopped or slowed down because the Environmental Protection Agency is not managing its Superfund staff effectively to match the workload. And that sounds to me like basically they're slowing down and nobody's cracking the whip. Such work is at a standstill or moving slowly on at least 4 Superfund sites where human exposure is not under control. That means contamination at the sites is unsafe for humans, and there's a reasonable expectation that people may be exposed to it. This report comes as EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt has said the cleanup of more than 1,300 listed Superfund sites is a priority, and it really ought to be, especially when you realize as these hurricanes demonstrate, they're not just going to sit there. You're going to have hurricanes, flooding, just leakage into the soil, into the groundwater. It is a huge mess out there. Now, getting into the world of computers, and there's a little bit of overlap here with the world of war, and all of a sudden, forget about Russian hackers. Forget about the Russian hackers. Now it's the Iranian hackers. We have to be afraid of the Iranian, those evil Iranians. They're the danger now. So we're seeing this story, again, from Associated Press, where Iran group hacks aviation and petrochemical industries. A group of hackers suspected of working in Iran for its government is targeting the aviation and petrochemical industries in Saudi Arabia, the United States, and South Korea. How do they know? As we pointed out before when they were screaming Russia, 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 the really expert cyber criminals, they'll compromise machines and have them strung out in a network 1,000 deep. All you really get at your server is the last server used to come into your system. And that could be anywhere on the earth. Another similar story, this is from the Daily Beast. Suspected Iranian hackers targeted U.S. Aerospace Center. This time the hackers were only conducting espionage via job recruiting links, but researchers worry the group, dubbed APT-33, has a capability to launch more destructive attacks. So now they're going to be out there. That group that was trying to fake the Russian hacking attacks, they've been retasked. Fake Iranian attacks. Fake Iranian attacks. You need to get on out there and just fake those Iranian attacks. We're getting another cautionary word here. This is from the Register out in Great Britain. As you know, today is the official debut of iOS 11. And the Register is out there saying you may want to hold off for a bit. Some of your existing apps are going to break, especially the 32-bit ones. And, of course, Apple has a history of always screwing up the first iteration of a new major update of their operating system. So there are going to be all kinds of problems here. I remember when iOS 10 came on out and devices were getting bricked. So we don't need to have the latest and greatest on our phone. Let's wait until it's stable, and then we'll use that. Unfortunately, the computer industry doesn't like that. They want you to buy new ones right now, and we don't care if they're unstable because we're indemnified from product liability, but we just have to find ways to make you buy new stuff. Somebody wrote on in, apparently Hewlett-Packard now actually has a subscription program for the ink cartridges, where you pay so much a month based on how many pages you expect to print. And they will automatically send you the new ink cartridges as you need them. And apparently you can roll your ink over, which obviously is going to be the case here. But again, this is a follow-on to the story about how the latest patch to the Hewlett-Packard printers will now prevent you from using a third-party ink cartridge. We'll be right back after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. We're going to go to the phones. Alex in Florida. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Michael, I never hear any commentator or any reporter ask Hillary Clinton about the server. I think that would solve the whole problem about her wanting to run again. And the death of Seth Rich.
Well,
I mean, she says she wants to run again.
No. That's not what she said. She said that she wants to get back into politics, but at this point she's saying she is not going to run for president again. But you're right. That server is at the heart of everything that was going on with Hillary Clinton during her time at the State Department, and it really should be looked at. But I think the reason that everybody is ignoring it is they understand if my theory is correct as to what Hillary was doing with that server, that's a scandal that would bring down the entire government. And that's why everybody's out there, oh, we're going to go after Donald Trump. Pay no attention to that server inside the bathroom in that office here. We're going to go after Donald Trump here.
Well, I heard, and I heard this secondhand information, but I heard she was saying if something comes out of the Russian probe that she wants a re-election.
Well,
that's what I heard.
No, she doesn't want a re-election. She wants to invalidate or reverse the last election. I don't think she'd take the chance of having a new election. Because first of all, it'd be hideously expensive to organize and put together. But Hillary is already aware the American people don't want to vote her into that Oval Office. And so the last thing she wants is a new election. She has stated she wants to delegitimize last year's election, and I guess at that point she would try and file a lawsuit saying that she is the rightful president of the United States of America. But no way will she trust her future to the ballot box ever again.
Yeah, and it's not only that; it's even the voters' rolls in all the different states. I mean, there's so many things that are just they're not. It's not normal to have like some of the counties. I believe in California, 144% more votes registered than there was actually registered voters.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that. I mean, we've got this situation up there in New Hampshire where apparently something like 6,000 people from Massachusetts drove up into New Hampshire and took advantage of the same-day registration law, showed their Massachusetts driver's license, said, we just moved here, I want to register to vote, and they voted for Hillary. And then in a subsequent follow-up, it was discovered none of these people had applied for a New Hampshire driver's license, meaning that they had not actually moved to New Hampshire. And I'm glad that Trump's Election Integrity Commission is looking at this information. But again, we're not likely to see the corporate media report on any of this because they are part of the problem, being that they are tied up with that Voters News Service where all the fakery is taking place.
That's right. The same press, they're the same people that told us Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. They're the ones that told us, like the little girl in Libya that said that during the first Iraq war that the Iraqis were taking kids off of the incubators and infants off the incubators in the hospital wards in Iraq, and that on and on. They're the biggest liars on the face of the earth.
Of course they are. Of course
none of it's questioned. They have never questioned any of the stories that come from the CIA.
No, they don't.
The press's job.
They're still pushing the Russian Trump collusion narrative, even though there's no evidence for it. They're still pushing the Russia hacked the DNC emails narrative, even though the evidence is clearly that it was an internal leak, most likely through Seth Rich. They're not interested in the facts. They're out there to, as George Bush said, catapult that propaganda forward and get you all bamboozled to go along with what the government wants you to be doing. Because that's how the government has been ruling the people for decade after decade after decade, lies, fraud, and deception. And we in the independent media have taken that away from them. And that's why they're so upset with us.
Yeah. Now, Michael, I hope I'm not wrong, but I think Trump's just having to say what he has to say to get, I think that, like you say, I think we're at our collapse, and I think he recognizes that. He's basically saying what he has to say as far as North Korea and all this stuff. I'm hoping that his actions will be that of what he campaigned on.
Well, I'd like to see it, but I don't think we're going to. And again, we don't know. One thing we do know is that information flow to the president is tightly under the control of Chief of Staff John Kelly. We know that Trump's advisors, like the head of the CIA, are lying to him. So they're crafting a matrix around him. where Trump may feel there is no choice but to go forward with attacking North Korea or attacking Iran or so forth and so on. And yes, a lot of his backers and supporters are very much on the war party as well. Trump is obviously buddy-buddy with Netanyahu, who's not interested in talking to anybody from Iran. And that, of course, again, the U.S. used to pretend that it was an objective, fair, unbiased arbitrator among the Middle Eastern nations, and now that has vanished since 9/11.
That's right. And I must say that I actually used the F-bomb when I heard him talking about blowing North Korea off the map or whatever it was that he said. I mean, that's ridiculous. It was reminding me of Obama talking a bunch of nonsense. And Obama never went that deep. His actions were that deep, or real doggone close to it. But some of his TPP campaigning and just on, acting like the press is true and fair is a joke.
Well, that's what they have to do. I mean, they're basically stuck with it. They've created this this image of an infallible government and a truthful media, and they have to stick with it. They can never, ever admit that they have ever lied to us, or it's all going to unravel. And so they're feeling kind of stuck, and you can almost get a sense of panic coming out of that deep state where they know they're losing control. And they don't know what to do about it. And so they're on the attack against alternative social media like Gab. They're on the attack against activists. They're on the attack against the servers of websites like mine. There's every dirty trick they can think of because they think it's their divine right. The goal is always to remain in control, to remain in power. That's the highest priority of any ruling body, is to maintain control and stay in power. And everything else is subordinate to that.
That's right. So I have relatives that live in Puerto Rico. I think that's a pretty bad storm that went through there.
That
They're
is
having a lot of bad times right now, real tough times.
It's going to be a few days before we actually find out how bad it is down there. But again, the expectation was they had not even recovered from the last storm. This one hit them head on. And they're saying that Puerto Rico could be totally without power, and it could be months before they get it back.
Yeah, and I was watching videos in the street, and I mean, it looks like rivers just going through some of the streets there. It looks bad, real bad. They say that basically every infrastructure's been damaged somewhat, some of them more severe, some of them just a little bit, but basically every building has been damaged. So our prayers have to go out for them. I'll tell you what, I can only imagine what that would be like.
Well, we hope the best for them, and again, I'm a little curious about how the Arecibo radio telescope fared in these storms. I hope it's still intact, but China just finished building a new one just like it, only twice as large. It's just absolutely gigantic that they just put into operation out there in China. They're doing amazing stuff over in China. Anyway, Alex, thank you very much. We're going to let you go.
Hey, Michael.
Yeah.
Michael, I want one more question. You
Sure.
can just answer it. I'll get off the phone. Do you think that we landed on the moon? Do you think we actually sent someone to the moon and astronauts got off and got on the moon?
Yes, we absolutely did, and
Okay.
no question about that. And I'll give you a good example.
Okay.
I mean, I'm going to respond to this because again, this campaign of kookification against the independent media is really ramping up. I got an email saying, there was no civil war. The slaves came here of their own free will. I mean, come on, guys, get out of here. One of the jobs that I had at JPL was analyzing lunar rock brought back by Apollo 12, as well as pieces of the Surveyor 3 that they'd clipped off when they were there. Now, why would they bother paying me to do that if it was all a fake? I mean, really, it just doesn't make any sense. Then you have the laser ranging retroreflectors. And the fact, and I know this because I worked on the lunar samples, the samples returned from the moon are different significantly than Earth rock. It is slightly different. Anyway, Alex, going to let you go, and we're going to switch over to Ralph in New York. Aloha, Ralph. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, hi, Mike. How you doing? I want to ask you a hypothetical question concerning the real estate market versus what just happened recently in South Florida with the hurricanes and the disasters that are happening in the Caribbean. And to see a lot of flourishing of migrants coming from those states coming to be in New York and also California. Do you think the bubble is going to happen here in the inner cities, like Chicago, New York, or the major outcomes when this fall happens, or is it just booming for landlords and property owners here for the condos here? What's your opinion on this one?
Generally, in the wake of a major disaster like this, property values are forced down because it isn't just the fact that there may not even be a house sitting on the property. It's going to definitely need repair or renovation, as well as the quality of life around the house has obviously been deteriorated as well. There are going to be businesses that are no longer in business. Real estate values are calculated not just on the basis of the land and the building, but what is around there in terms of conveniences and things that the home buyer are going to want to avail themselves of. So the general history has always been that these disasters will depress housing prices for a few years. And, for people who have that kind of flexibility, time to maybe go on in and buy at the floor and ride it on the way up. But the problem with all the refugees and everything coming in from places like the Caribbean, they have nothing to buy a house with. A lot of these people, and not just in the Caribbean, even across Texas and Florida, the survivors literally are left with absolutely nothing. And that's, again, an issue that we all need to be dealing with, I think, long before we go after Iran and North Korea. We got to be taking care of our own American people.
Now, even though Donald Trump was a former real estate guy here in New York, what do you think the Chinese are going to basically unflush all this massive real estate they've been buying up here now and dump the U.S. dollar? Is that part of it also?
Well, China has slowed their buying of U.S. properties because they recognize that it is in a bubble, and a lot of people are very concerned that if the U.S. carries through with more sanctions against China, the sanctions will include a ban on buying American property. And so that has kind of slowed down as well. But we already know that a lot of countries, not just China, want to drop the dollar because they don't see it as trustworthy or reliable for the future. They're all looking at the indications there's going to be a major drop in the U.S. economy, and they don't want to be the ones, left holding that dollar when the music stops.
So you're saying we are on that trend right now, the way things are going, the way things are going right now.
I think we are seeing we're going to see a drag down on the real estate markets everywhere where the storms hit, and even if there was no damage. New home buyers tend to stay away from places that have recently had a disaster because of their concern that it could happen again. Usually you'll find real estate prices going up after it's been a while, and people sort of think of these things like hurricanes and earthquakes as an abstraction until the next reminder. So I think overall, we're going to see a decline in the real estate market in those hurricane-hit areas. This, in turn, may drive a slight increase in real estate prices in those parts of the countries that are perceived to be safer places to live.
Now, one question, you see, for example, I read the New York Times, and I read this in the Sunday section of the New York Times. I see like 20 to 30 pages of property for sale all over like, the New York area. You see like condos, apartment buildings. They say, wait a minute, the smart ones are trying to sell before they know the coming crash is coming, right? Do you know this is part of it also, or is it just basically just going to let it go?
Well, unfortunately, we're starting to see a repeat of the 2008 real estate frothing, where people are buying a property and then they'll hold it for a few days or a few weeks, and then they're trying to sell it, at a profit. The question is, how many of them are actually succeeding in finding customers, or are we going to see another 2008 pop of the housing bubble again? And I think we're getting close on that. Everything's bubbled up right now. There's a new mortgage housing bubble that's out there, student loan bubble. It's all bubble everywhere that you go. The entire economy is running on bubbles right now.
And the millennials are basically feeling the effect more than anybody else, right?
Well, the millennials, it depends. The ones with the college degrees that are not getting them a high-paying job, because of their student loans, they're actually not getting into the real estate market. And that has to be a factor where you realize that at the moment it should be a seller's market, but they're still acting like it's a buyer's market. And that may lead to a stall of the entire system. It's not that these young millennials don't want to buy a home. It's just that they literally cannot. And so at some point, you're going to the upward cycle has to break.
Wow. Obviously, I mean, everyone's kind of curious between what's the difference between Obama and Trump concerning this market. Everyone's curious about that. You know, what's your opinion concerning Trump versus Obama involving the real estate market? Do you see any trends between both of them, or are they both actually in the same pattern?
Well, it's not really that much of a pattern. I don't think Obama, in fact, I don't even think going all the way back to George W. Bush, they're really able to do much of anything other than prop up the stock market to use as a political banner. I think our entire economy has spun out of control, not only of the government, but of Wall Street itself. And everybody's just kind of hanging on for the ride and hoping that their golden parachutes are going to open when it all starts to come apart.
Wow. Okay, then. All right, Mike, thank you very much, and thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to let you go. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. So we already talked about the new iOS 11 and why you probably ought to take a little bit of a break before you update to that. We're going to take a break for commercials. We're going to come on back. More news about the world of computers. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're going to go to the phones here. Don in Iowa. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, Mike, you're talking about the political correctness where people can't say what's on their mind anymore. It always makes me think when I was a kid growing up, and there was one thing that everybody always told us, and I remember this, and I used it because it worked. The teachers would tell you, all the grown-ups would tell you the same thing. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me.
Well, it's sound wisdom. You know, we all had thick skins back there, but, you know, the liberals are pushing this culture of victimhood, and if they can't find enough victims, then they invent new offenses, microaggressions, triggering moments. And it's created a nation of whiners who are just absolutely, they're thrown into a tizzy by the least little thing. And we're going to grab these kids and march them off into a world war? I don't think so.
Yeah, the kids are totally screwed up now.
Yes, they are.
As far as the wartime deal, I'm kind of like you. I was for Bernie Sanders first.
Yes.
And I actually donated $9, I remember, to Bernie. But then after he lost, then I was for Trump because I thought they had something in common. They were both, at least Trump did kill the TPP. The first thing he did when he got elected, killed the TPP, which was going to go down anyway. But Bernie would have gone farther. I think he would have tried to get aggressive with Wall Street and actually throw some guys in jail. And also, I believe he would have tried to push for. I don't know if he would have been able to push against the Pentagon, because a lot of them have high ideas when they get in there, and they end up just knuckling under to the Pentagon.
I think that's the reality there, is that Bernie Sanders would have been brought to heel just the way that Donald Trump was. They wouldn't have needed to bring Hillary Clinton to heel because she's fully on board already with all of these agendas, endless war and, you know, open borders and the one world order and the rest of it. So, I don't think Bernie would have been doing any better than Donald Trump is right now. And Donald Trump's done a few things I really like. I like his focus on NASA. He certainly made a strong start regarding immigration, but he seems to be backing off on that now.
Well, maybe you could run for senator over there in Hawaii, Mike. You probably lack of funding would be one of your obstacles, but I got a way around that. What you do is just it's a bunch of islands, so when it's time to go to the next island, just swim. And that way you get a lot of press coverage.
At my age, I don't think I would make it, and there are sharks out there. So thank you, but I think I'm going to take a pass on that suggestion.
Okay, I'll take it easy.
I appreciate the thought. I appreciate the thought there. I mean, I did have my joke campaign last year. You know, Rivero, 2016, he could hardly do any worse. And no, I couldn't here. But again, on Trump's positive side of the ledger, I do like the fact that he's pushing for more money for NASA and retasking them. He's pulling them away from all this global warming nonsense and trying to get them to sort of regain lead or at least parity in the space race. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 3. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And we're going to go to Dan in Missouri. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. I really appreciate you taking this call. And I guess I'm going to try whipping this dead horse a little bit. I saw a movie, it's been a number of years ago, and it had to do with the moon landing, if you don't mind. And they brought up a number of points that seemed irrefutable, but then I'm not a scientist. One was the Van Allen radiation belt. How do you, and I'm not arguing with you by any means, sir, but they say it'd take 3 to 4 feet of lead to keep from frying an astronaut to get through that.
Well, you certainly don't want to park an astronaut in that Van Allen radiation belt for any prolonged amount of time. But the outgoing and inbound Apollo was only exposed to that radiation for a very short period of time, roughly the equivalent of a couple of chest x-rays. And the astronauts all realized that, yes, out in space they were going to be exposed to more radiation, and it came with a risk of developing illnesses later in life, but that was a sacrifice they were willing to make.
Okay, I guess I'll take that one. How about the perfect footprint on the moon with no moisture in the atmosphere?
Why wouldn't there be a perfect footprint with no moisture in the air? First of all, you need to understand the lunar soil is this incredibly fine powder. And when I was at JPL, we were working at literally making simulants of the lunar soil based on the data returned by the surveyors. And you could stick your thumb in it and it would record your fingerprint. That's how fine it was.
Okay. And again, I'm not trying to argue with you, but if there was that fine a powder right underneath that landing module, and from what I understood, the landing module had a 10,000-pound thrust rocket that had to be pulsed. You couldn't throttle it back. It was either on or off.
No.
So there shouldn't have been any dust underneath that module after it landed.
Well, what's underneath the dust is more dust. And by the way, you're in error. The descent engine on the LEM was the one throttleable engine that was on Apollo. All the others were on-off, including the RCS and the SPS and the ascent stage, but they had to have a throttleable engine on that descent module, and it made it less efficient. They had to carry more fuel, but it was a brilliant little design. But yes, in fact, if you look at the footage taken from the ascent module during takeoff, you can see a huge amount of dust gets blown on out there. But underneath the dust is more dust.
Well, then there should have been a hole. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be argumentative either, but there's just too many. Okay, one last thing, and I'll get off of this one. In this movie, Was It Only a Paper Moon, this guy got to go to the, I guess a museum somewhere, maybe down in Alabama, I don't know exactly where it was, but the curator of the museum let him get in a cherry picker and go up and look into the window of that landing module.
Okay.
And there was room for 2 men to stand in there with their feet on either side of the head of that descent rocket, I guess you might call it. And he looked in that little window, and he could visually pretty much tell how much room was in there. And, of course, both astronauts would have had that suitcase on their back. And he asked, and the guy that was the curator of the museum was the guy that used to train the astronauts, according to this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked him, he said, "Which way does the door open?" And the guy looked at him and says, "Well, it opens in." And then he asked, "Well, if it opens in, where does one astronaut go so the door can open in so the other one can get out?" And the curator of the museum that trained those boys, his answer was, and it's on tape, I mean, you can see it, he says, "Oh, we let them figure it out."
Yeah, that was basically how it worked. Now, first of all, the first mistake you made is the top cover of the ascent engine, because, yes, it was way up inside the ascent stage, the way they made the lunar module naturally stable, because it didn't have to be aerodynamic. They didn't have to put the engine at the bottom and pile everything on top. The engines were way up inside, so that center of thrust for the engine was above the center of gravity for the lunar module, and that kept it naturally stable. They didn't have to have a lot of additional hardware. But in point of fact, during training, the astronauts would work out the best way to get these things around there, and it was extraordinarily cramped in there, and they couldn't see where they were going with the backpack on, the plus, and they would have to guide each other going in and out. So it was very tight, but it was a case of either have it very tight or not go at all. Anyway, listen, I really I want to let this phone call go here because we're not that kind of a show, and I've been very, very patient with you. But again, the landing sites for the Apollo have been imaged by satellites belonging to countries that are not necessarily America's friends. So if they had looked at the landing sites and found nothing, they certainly would be out there saying so. All right, thank you very much. We're going to let you go and switch over to Tom in Florida. Aloha, Tom. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Tom, are you there?
Can you hear me, Michael?
I can hear you now.
Okay, Michael, good day to you. First off, yeah, that hurricane, we're probably going to have like 2 or 3 million Puerto Ricans coming in mainland because I heard they're going to be power. They may be without power for months. The whole island's getting blown away, I guess.
Yes, it's horrible. Horrible, horrible.
It is. And what's going on in Mexico is insane, too. But here's the reason I called you, Michael. There's a few reasons. And the first one, second one, I want to go to DACA. But first reason I wanted to call you, they were talking today on the news again here in South Florida because, of course, because of the Cuban situation. And all these consulars in Cuba were getting sick with, they were using, a sound wave device. What actual device are these Cuban government using against our embassies?
Well, first
make all these people so sick and violently sick.
First of all, why would the Cuban government do anything like that? The Cuban government wants normalization of relations. They want an end to the 60-plus year blockade the U.S. has maintained around their country. They're not going to do anything to harm our diplomats. If something really is actually being done, it's being done by a third party that wants to sabotage the normalization of relations with Cuba. Again, to find out if you're being lied to, look for what should be there and isn't, and what isn't there in this case is a reason for Cuba to do something like this. Now, in theory, very powerful infrasound below the range of human hearing can make people feel very uneasy, or if loud enough can even result in nausea. But some of the descriptions of the sounds that were in the news about these grating sounds that appeared only in certain locations sounds a little fantastical to me, and I think this is more propaganda to try and support the agenda of, again, reasserting the blockade on Cuba, and I think that's a really dumb thing to be doing, because if we're going to go to war with Russia, the last thing we want to do is repeat the mistake that was made during Castro's time, because when Castro took power in Cuba, he approached the United States about normalizing relations. He wanted to be friends with the United States, and the United States threw a tantrum and said absolutely not, and that's what forced Castro to become a Soviet satellite. We don't want to repeat that same mistake all over again. And so this attempt to destroy the normalization of relations with Cuba that's very poor thinking. We're practically inviting Russia and Cuba to renew their relationship. And that's going to put a Russian point of power projection 90 miles off the coast of the United States. It's a stupid thing to do.
Yeah, so you're right, Michael. Michael, you're right. But another thing, this last Hurricane Irma did hit Cuba as a Category 5. Puerto Rico today got hit with a Category 4. They're not actually showing even images of what's going on in Cuba with the Category 5. Some of their cities got blown out. And I don't know how that's going to be taken care of, but I am in total agreement with you. Why would the Cuban government try to turn on our government and try to harm all these people? They're saying they got harmed, like 200 people got come down real violently illy sick. And I mean, I don't understand it. I totally agree. I think that's some kind of ploy. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if the deep state's behind that or what. But Michael, another thing I want to talk about. This is the main thing. The other day I saw this imbecilic woman, Nancy Pelosi, along with all these illegal aliens in our country, screaming at her, calling her name, calling her a liar, and all this. And these people are protesting in that audience, or they're illegally in that audience. How come Donald Trump and the federal government don't go round them up and deport them? The word illegal means illegal. Now, if you steal a fruit out of a store and you're hungry, you're going to get caught. You're going to go to jail. These people are in there screaming, calling Nancy Pelosi a liberal Democrat, a liar this, liar that. But in the meantime, they're illegally in that hall. And why isn't the government, the federal ICE, going in there and taking these people, running them up, put them in detention, and deporting them?
Well, they should have.
Literally, they're calling a United States Congresswoman a liar.
Well, the reason they're angry with her is because apparently Trump and Pelosi and a bunch of these others have made a deal to grant citizenship to something like 3 million illegal immigrants, but there are 11 million illegal immigrants in the country, and they're out there demanding it's all of us. You got to do all of us. But you're absolutely right. They are illegal, and this whole illegal immigration problem would go away if we were just enforcing the existing immigration laws. But you're getting this huge pushback from all these liberal cities where they're saying we refuse to allow the federal government to enforce the laws here. And now you've had another judge come on down and say that Trump can't withhold grant money to sanctuary cities in order to coerce their compliance with existing law. But that's exactly what's going on. The mayors and of these cities, the governors of these states are in violation of Title VIII, and they face serious jail time for providing aid, comfort, and shelter to illegal immigrants who shouldn't be here. And it's multiplied. Each count is multiplied for each immigrant that they helped. So when you're talking about thousands and millions of immigrants in the state of California, you're talking about a really long jail sentence for Jerry Brown.
Well, Michael, let me ask you this. Say that Donald Trump and the Republican Party said to California, go ahead, break away from the Union, become your own government, become Northern Mexico, and you know what, Michael, just think how the Republicans will hold power for the next 100 years, because there won't be 55 electoral votes to go in toward the presidential election. The Republicans win every time. If you take California out of the equation, and the Democrats don't have nothing to stand on. Forget New York. I'm just talking to get rid of Democratic illegal California. The Republicans hold power for the next 100 years. So they don't have to worry about the presidential election where the Democrats are going to get all these electoral votes in California. So if I was the Republican Party, I'd tell the Democratic Party, go ahead, take your state of California and break away. Become your own government.
They're never going to let it happen. They're never going to let it happen for the same reason that the Spanish government is never going to allow Catalonia to break free, because Catalonia is a cash cow for Spain and California is a cash cow for the U.S. government. There's a huge amount of money coming out of California that the federal government needs. And right now we're getting word that apparently the Spanish police are now arresting the top Catalan officials to try and put an end to this independence referendum situation. The same thing would happen if California tried to secede. Look at what happened in the Civil War. The southern states seceded over what they felt was inappropriate interference in their internal affairs by Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. declared war to capture them and bring them back on in, and then put a whole bunch of amendments into the Constitution to try and federalize the country and lock the system in the way it is. They'll never let California go.
Well, Michael, I hear you. And, I watched on the History Channel the other day. I don't know if you got to see this. And they're talking about slavery. The biggest slave owners in 1865 were black men?
Yes.
Two of the biggest slave owners in the United States at that time? They never talk about that Black Lives Matter. But they want to talk, it's always been a white man. I didn't realize how much there was black slave owners. I couldn't believe what I was seeing.
Yeah, and don't forget,
I wasn't taught that in school.
The slave traders were black. The ones who were in Africa capturing the slaves and selling them to the ships, they were black as well. I mean, it's not this...
For whiskey.
Yeah, well, for a lot of different things. For metal, metal was very accepted. Anyway, listen, Tom, we're going to let you go. We got to do a shout out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network, and we're going to go to James in Atlanta. Aloha, James. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
We lost him.
We lost him. All right, let's go to Roxanne in Texas. Aloha, Roxanne. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi. I want to talk about kind of tie in for the perplexities that people may have. Have you ever heard of a professor, James McKinney?
Obliquely, yes. I've heard the name, not much else.
Yeah, he's a regular guest on John Moore's show on Wednesday mornings.
Mm-hmm.
And he has like 8 books out. He has this website. Maybe you can take a look whenever you get time. But, John Moore, I would say 85 to 90% of the RBN hosts all do talk about weather modification. So that's what maybe some of your listeners might be perplexed about.
Well, again, we went over this topic the other day about weather modification, and it's one thing to create a vortex or a wave in a small controlled laboratory situation, and quite another to carry it out on the scale of, shall we say, an entire hemisphere. And again, as that one other caller came on in and said, well, you know, the U.S. government is always keeping itself 20 years ahead of what the civilians are doing. And my response to that was, if the U.S. government is controlling the weather, why are they steering all of these monster storms onto the U.S. territory? And so forth and so on. Why not steer them someplace else? And again, there isn't really anything that's that unusual about this hurricane season. If you look at the hurricane statistics for the last 160 years, it's pretty much a flat line. Some years are a little more, some years are a little less. This year is a little bit more, but it's not exceptionally so. There have been years in the past where we had more of these storms.
Well, I'm just saying that's what maybe perplexes some of your listeners, is because all the other hosts talk about it. James McCaney actually stirred hurricanes out with the Russians.
Okay, Roxanne.
Yeah. But anyway,
Roxanne,
I just let it go.
Yeah, I think you should let it go. And I don't care if the other RBN hosts are talking about it. I don't care if Jeff Nuri is talking about it. Based on my scientific background, I don't see it really happening. I know there's been some minor success with cloud seeding to generate rain, which has resulted in lawsuits from those people who are downwind from where the cloud seeding is taking place. But this idea that somebody can create and steer a tornado or a hurricane, it just cannot be done at this stage of our technology. We're going to switch over to James in Atlanta. Aloha, James. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi. I hadn't heard anything from Joe Biden lately. Is he still planning to make a run?
I have heard nothing from him either. He took a little bit of a bruising very early in the primaries last time he ran. But at least he's following the tradition of most American candidates, and he's just sort of going off and being quiet, unlike Hillary Clinton. But I don't know what he's up to these days.
I didn't see him during any of the hurricanes. I just kind of thought he kind of disappeared. I wanted to ask you about the Alwan brothers. What were they contracted to do, and why couldn't the DNC use a big company like Amazon or Google instead of some small guys like this?
Well, Amazon and Google will sell you services from outside, cloud services and so forth. The Alwan brothers were hired as IT specialists to work inside the House of Representatives on various representatives' computers, to actually go into their offices and do maintenance, clean up on the machines. And they were actually contracted individually to different members of the House of Representatives. So they were pulling in quite a bit of money, but as it turns out, they were also running an espionage operation.
Did they have experience? Do you know why they might have been chosen, like they had references and everything? Or
I'm really not sure. I mean, we do know that Imran Awan was very good friends with Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who would have been in a position to recommend him, but I don't know if that actually happened.
Do you remember in the Bernie Madoff case, he pointed out about why he used such a small accountant? And it just seemed kind of like a similar, parallel. Why would they use a small firm versus a big firm?
Well, again, there are large firms that will do IT maintenance in your office, and that's a valid question why they didn't go that way. But again, if you're talking about Amazon or you're talking about Google, they sell services. They do not send people into your office to fix your particular machine. That's more of a Geek Squad kind of a thing to do.
Okay, I was just curious about that. Thanks, and hope you have a great day.
All right, thanks an awful lot here. We're coming up on a break here, so we're going to hold the next phone call off. Okay, I guess he hung up the phone anyway. So we're going to take a break here for some commercials, and when we come on back, we've got more news from all kinds of stuff that's going on here. So stay tuned, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And some of the people who write into the show, they are so funny. I wish I could share this with you, but the FCC would come on in and take our licenses away. All right, let's get on back to the world of computers here. And again, relating to this lure of education. Come on in, get a college degree, you will get a high-paying job. And there's this article that came on out here that said over in Great Britain, university is very expensive, and very often people are choosing to major in a course where the degree isn't going to get them a high-paying job. I mean, how many art history majors can you come with? But the general belief is that if you get a degree in computer science, you will get a nice, fat, well-paid job at the end. Well, as it turns out, programmers with a bachelor's degree only earn £3,000 more a year than coders who don't have the degree. This is according to a survey of 4,700 developers in Great Britain by Stack Overflow. And despite the average degree now costing £9,000 a year in tuition fees alone, much of that as a student loan. So in point of fact, you're coming out money behind getting that degree. Now, I don't know how the world of software development is right now, but when I was a kid, a lot of programmers, myself included, we were self-taught. And employers were looking for somebody who could write code. And if you could write decent code, they didn't care if you had a degree or not. And I think more and more employers are starting to realize that a college degree does not necessarily guarantee proficiency with the current decayed economic system that we have. And a lot of software jobs, there'll be an exam that you have to take to be considered for employment. You should see the one for Microsoft. Oh, that thing is just rigid as all get out. You have to eat, sleep, and breathe Microsoft to have a chance at getting a job up there. Now then, let's talk about Equifax. It's starting to get a lot of coverage on the corporate media. And now it's coming on out, first of all, that Equifax had a data breach months before they announced it. They kept it secret. A lot of it has to do with a vulnerability in the Apache Struts component, and now it's turning out that apparently, according to the automation vendor Sonatype, 3,054 organizations downloaded the same Struts 2 component exploited in the Equifax hacks in the last 12 months and have not applied the patches. So a big part of our security problem is that as corporations are cutting their budgets, they're cutting back on their IT staff. And so the necessary maintenance and security is not being done. Security on a computer system is a full-time job. You can't just have somebody who's maintaining your database and say, oh, by the way, in your spare time, make sure we're not being attacked. It doesn't work that way. There's literally a war out there where the cyber criminals want your money, your data, your secrets. Now, there's a new ransomware attack. It's sweeping the globe right now, and apparently it is an automated system that alters the ransomware so that you can't have a filter for it, because it's showing up in about 8,000 different versions of this script. And apparently it is hitting at a steady rate of 2 million attacks per hour. Somebody's got some serious iron pushing this forward. Why not? There's big money in ransomware. And it's not like the government is going to do anything about it. The government's just worried about shutting down the independent media and conservative views. They don't care about little things like your money and your data being stolen here. Now, again, what these credit companies should be doing in the wake of the Equifax breach is they should reissue every single credit card with a whole new account number and cancel the last ones. This invalidates all the data stolen out of Equifax, except obviously the Social Security numbers, which have been exposed. But they're not going to do that. They don't want to spend the money. Meanwhile, you have all these other companies like LifeLock and all these other security companies. They're having a heck of a day. They're out there with all these commercials saying, if you had our software, you would have been safe. And they all say the same thing, and then there's another breach. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And stepping back in our talking points here, apparently Caracas, Venezuela, has failed to make their September 15th interest payment. So at this point, it looks like Venezuela is in a state of bankruptcy. And again, I know Donald Trump is blaming it on socialism. but Venezuela has been the victim of economic warfare by the United States for decades, especially because Venezuela likes to sell their oil for currencies other than the U.S. dollar. But at this point, it does seem like a default is inevitable, and what repercussions that may have around the globe, we do not know. Now, getting on back to the hurricanes here, a lot of people were applying the broken window analogy to the hurricane victims, because we were seeing all these films of cars flooded out and outright destroyed, and it was predicted that this would produce a surge in car sales, which would be good for the auto industry. Yes, it was bad for all those people in Texas and Florida and all that area, but hey, it's going to be good for the auto industry. Well, we're not actually seeing it. Now, remember that there is a huge surplus of already built cars that are sitting on all these lots, but it doesn't look like there's going to be that much of a hurricane bounce. Ford has just shut down 5 of their North American plants in the wake of slumping car sales. See, here is the problem. Most of those people in those flooded out areas along Texas, Louisiana, and the other areas there, because they lived in flood inundation zones, they couldn't afford flood insurance. And that means they don't really have the money to just go on out and buy a new car. Many of them have probably lost not just their homes, but their place of employment. And so the idea that this was going to somehow magically turn out to be a blessing for the car industry would have been nice if it happened, but the resiliency in our economy just isn't there anymore. It's been stretched to the absolute limit. People don't have savings. They don't have any cushions. They don't have any buffer. And they're not able to just go on. These are people who are just going to have to learn how to live without having a car. Take the buses, take public transportation. The Agenda 2030 people are going to like that one. Or the Agenda 30 people are going to like that one. But they're not seeing the bounce there. People just don't have money, and these people have just lost pretty much everything they had. It's unrealistic to expect that they're going to go on out and just buy another car. I'll tell you what would be good for these people in these flooded zones and the auto industry is for Donald Trump to sort of do a scaled-up version of Ronald Reagan's cheese giveaway. Remember back when Reagan was president, there was a huge surplus of cheese, overproduced cheese, and so the government basically just grabbed it all and they sent it out to Americans. Big, huge block of cheese. It was actually good cheese, too. Well, do you want to have all these cars sitting on these lots just starting to corrode in the weather and environment? Because they're not covered. They're not covered. They're just out there in the open on these huge lots. We've got one down here at the bottom of the hill. Let's just start giving these hurricane flood victims a new car and draw down that surplus of manufactured vehicles. Then as Americans that are in the areas that are not hit by the flood start to buy cars, the factories can be restarted and the workers go back to work. And maybe the auto companies can take the cost of that inventory off their future taxes, some kind of long-term amortization over the next 20, 25 years. I think that would be the best way to go forward on this. Help these people get back on their feet. Get them a new car, a new truck, especially for those people in the farming community. Can't really operate without a truck. I think that would be a good solution, allocation of the available resources to those who are totally in need. And I know Trump would hate my saying that because it sounds, dangerously close to socialism, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. But in this case, it looks like a workable model. It looks like the only model that can work. And I think it would be a really, really good idea. And if you're going to start handing out free cars, I could certainly use one myself. So let's get on to the world of human-caused global warming. It's being a really bad year for the global warming alarmists. They're still out there trying to scream it's warming. The hurricanes are caused by human-caused global warming. And no, they're not. As we've pointed out many times before, There is nothing really unusual about this year's storm season. We have had many years just like them in the past. If you chart the number of hurricanes over the last 160 years, it's pretty much a flat line. And as I said many times before, it's not just temperature that causes a storm, it's a temperature differential. And you can get a really monstrous storm by upper atmosphere cooling as much as by warming the ground and the ocean. Now, we have a new science paper just published in the science journal Nature Geoscience, and the paper, authored by Miles R. Allen, Richard J. Miller, and others, reveals that global warming climate models have been flat out wrong because they were deceptively biased toward worst-case warming predictions. This includes the IPCC climate models. In other words, these climate models were not trying to model what was likely to happen, but were skewed toward the worst possible case of warming, which didn't really happen. Let's take a phone call from George in Texas. Aloha, George. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing okay.
Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
You know, I know I submitted to your website, but I'm talking to certain people, observing, especially the people who lost it all during the Hurricane Harvey. The add-on is the stress of trying to put a roof over their family's head, food and car and all that stuff. Is the added stress of seeing Christmas decorations, because even in the Walmart, they're starting to gut the garden center and put up Christmas.
Oh, I can't stand it. Claire and I went to the big box store this morning. It's all up there. The trees are up there. The lights are up there. They got ribbons. The only thing they didn't have was Christmas wrapping paper, which is the one thing we actually wanted to get because we did our Christmas shopping for the little kiddies at Toys R Us before they closed their doors. And they didn't have the, but yeah, it was all over there. The trees, everything, the lights were blinking, and it was just, this is still September. We still have Halloween and Thanksgiving to get through. And they do this every single year to try and get everybody all hot and bothered for the holiday shopping season. And frankly, when they start it this early, by the time Halloween gets here, I'm going to be in full-blown Ebenezer Scrooge mode, shouting bah humbug at all of this stuff. And by the time we actually get to Christmas, it's not going to be decoration, it's going to be decor, and it's tacky.
And the thing is, you got, like I say, the victims of Harvey, you have families, have young children. Seeing the holiday, trying to advertise the holiday spirit only adds one more worry. They're trying to get a place and a roof over their head. The last thing they want to worry about is Christmas trees.
Well, I have a feeling that probably down there in those flooded out zones and everything, the stores probably are not putting up the Christmas decorations. I could be wrong on that. I think these people have been driven down to the bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Absolutely reminding them that they have to get ready for Christmas, that's probably just going to add more stress to them.
Oh, for folks like us, we're going to try to help them out as much as we can.
Yes.
Make that stress a little bit less. I mean, we're going to come together. It's going to be hard enough, but we're going to come together and help these people out when the time comes.
We absolutely do.
We're not going to leave them hanging.
And again, one of the most, I hate to use the word beautiful, but it's appropriate here. One of the most beautiful things I saw coming out of these hurricanes were all these photos of people, Americans, helping each other without regard to skin color or ethnicity or gender or anything. Black people were helping white people were helping black people, and it was absolutely gorgeous, and it yanked the rug out from underneath this Black Lives Matter Antifa agenda of trying to portray the United States as having a serious racial discrimination problem. You tell that to those people down there in Texas and Louisiana who got dragged out of the floodwaters by people with different colored skin. You ask them if there's a racial problem in this country.
Yeah, especially that black family was rescued by that airboat that had a Confederate flag on it.
And the liberals made such a big deal about it. Oh, horrible! It's a boat here. I would have drowned rather than been saved by a boat with a Confederate flag on there. I mean, what utter nonsense! I mean, regardless of the flag on the back of that boat, that guy was out there. He was walking his talk. He was helping those people out, and they needed his help. And when push comes to shove, Americans will pull together in times of adversity. And it's only when we listen to these talking heads and these liberals that sell us this idea that we're supposed to hate people of different colors. Reminds me of South Pacific. There was actually a very brilliant song that was in there about you've got to be taught how to hate all the people your relatives hate. And it was one of the most insightful songs in the entire musical at a time when this kind of politics just didn't appear on the musical stage.
Well, Mike, I'll let you wrap up your show.
All right, thanks.
Hey, have a good day.
All right, same to you. All right, there we go. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, I mean, during times of adversity, Americans do pull together. And we will pull together. And we just need to be careful. Again, there's a lot of scammers out there. A lot of fraud is out there. A lot of people have set up phony charities. And it almost seems like these disasters will bring out the very best and the very worst in our human nature. And we have to celebrate that positive side, and we ought to take that negative side and slap them upside of the head. It's almost shameful to see Americans trying to take advantage of these disasters, scam a little bit more money out of these poor people, or anybody else that's out there. Now, getting on back to the human cause global warming. We're talking about this article in the Nature Geoscience was just published, and it basically admits the computer models used by the global warming fanatics overstated the impact of carbon dioxide on climate. And they're finally actually admitting that, in point of fact, the Earth really isn't warming catastrophically. And by the way, it is snowing on Mount Hood right now, which means summer is more or less unofficially over. I don't know when summer actually ends. It's close. It's the next few days. But then we're into autumn. But we're already seeing snow start to hit the U.S., the Northern Hemisphere. And apparently there are already road closures from some of these places. The snow is that heavy. Now, down in Los Angeles, all of a sudden, that outbreak of hepatitis A down in San Diego, it's now reached Los Angeles. And apparently it is just tearing through the homeless population. And they've got 10 cases of hepatitis A so far there. But looking at what's been going on down in San Diego, they know it can get a lot worse. So what starts in San Diego and moves to Los Angeles? One of the big arguments I have against the open borders is there are no medical checks. Even during the heyday of immigration to America in the 1930s, the Statue of Liberty and everything else, everybody coming in from Europe still had to go through Ellis Island. They had to have a medical check. If they were sick, they were either placed in quarantine until they were no longer infectious, or they were sent back home. They didn't just open the doors and let everybody walk on in with H1N1, scabies, bubonic plague, hepatitis. It's a horrible, horrible situation. And adding fuel to the fire there, the World Health Organization is now warning that the world is running out of antibiotics. Well, not all antibiotics. The problem is antibiotics have been used so much, overused so much, it's created a problem of antibiotic-resistant strains of illnesses. And what they're running out of are new antibiotics able to deal with illnesses that have evolved to be immune to antibiotics. So they're trying to come up with a new whiz-bang chemical, and it's a fight. The bugs are evolving as fast as science can come up with a new antibiotic to deal with them. Now, here's an interesting little story, and I think we should pay attention to it, given the scourge of cancer, which is, by the way, it's a modern scourge. You go back and you look at the mummified pharaohs or Otzi the Iceman or those Peruvian mummies, you don't find cancer in them. It's a new, just over the last 100 years, has it really become this major scourge. And estimates are now that 40% of cancers are caused by chemicals in our environment. So apparently there was this woman, 49 years old, Lynn Cameron, was diagnosed with a brain tumor, inoperable, and told she had just 6 to 18 months to live. And she went through chemotherapy and radiotherapy, did not help. And so she decided, since there was nothing else to go with, she tried cannabis oil, which is the non-intoxicating extract from cannabis. It's not the THC, it's cannabis oil. You can actually own it. It's perfectly legal. And apparently, she started feeling better. And a scan later on revealed the tumor had disappeared. Now, again, we know that 25% of cancers will spontaneously remit. They'll go away. The orthodox medical establishment's attitude is, we don't know which 25% are going to cure themselves, therefore we're going to treat everybody. It's money, 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 money. But we know that the cancer industry is big business. They don't want there to actually be a cure. What they want is another treatment, a very expensive treatment. Inexpensive treatments will be driven out of business or made illegal. Hydrazine sulfate is a good example of that. Because the medical establishment is not about your health, it's not about caring for the sick, it's about using that fear of death and illness to just wring more money out of your pocket. It used to be medicine was about healing. It was a service. Richard Nixon changed that with the Health Maintenance Organization Act. And it turned medicine from being about patient health and cures into just another money-making racket. We'll be right back with the last segment of our program after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our program. Last segment of our program today. And boy, it just seems like Equifax cannot get their act together. Just had this story that came on out here. Following the admission that Equifax had a major security breach, which resulted in 143 million people's personal information being stolen, including their Social Security numbers. Equifax set up a website, EquifaxSecurity2017.com, for possible victims to verify whether they were affected. Now, because the process involves sharing sensitive information, consumers have to trust they're entering their data in the right place. Well, unfortunately, Equifax tweeted out the wrong address. They tweeted out SecurityEquifax2017.com, which was set up as a phishing site after the announcement to trap people into coming in and turning over their personal details, and Equifax tweeted out the wrong URL. So again, if you're going to go there, the phony phishing site is Security Equifax 2017, and the one you should be going to is Equifax Security 2017. Now, mind you, if you sign up for any of Equifax's services to protect or audit your data, they include a rider in which you promise you will not join any class action lawsuits against them. So you may want to think about that very, very carefully before you sign on for that. They're out to protect themselves, not you. We actually had a commentator on one of our local radio stations here was talking about this, saying, why is the burden of work always put on the consumer to detect the fraud and then go on in and report it? Why aren't these credit bureaus more proactive in discovering the fraud? Well, as we're learning now from the stories of Equifax IT management, they were just sitting and coasting along. They had an unpatched vulnerability, which apparently a lot of people knew about. They had a penetration last March that they kept quiet. I wonder how many people were affected by that one. It's really becoming a joke. Right now, everybody's online identity is untrustworthy. They've all been compromised. Okay, another story coming out of Natural News here. A recent report by Public Health England has revealed that flu vaccines don't work on the elderly. That would be me. They're still out there pushing it, trying to get you to buy it, but it turns out it just doesn't seem to have any effect at preventing influenza in the elderly. The flu shot was totally ineffective. Last year's flu shot was totally ineffective for the elderly. But it makes money, and it makes money, and making money is a good thing. How can you get in the way of people making money? Well, I don't mind people making money the old-fashioned way, selling a good product or a good service to people who want it at a decent price. I just sort of object to this fascist approach of crappy products that we're commanded to buy by the government at exorbitant prices. That does not work for me. It's not the American way. There's the music. Time for me to get on out of here and get something done useful for the rest of the day. Please stay tuned to John Stedmiller. He's got a lot of interesting things to share with you. We'll be back tomorrow on RBN. Aloha, America.